Do you consider yourself to be a patriotic American? Let's find out. And to those ends, let me start by asking a question that sounds obvious, but it isn't. Do you want to live in a democracy? Be honest. Most people say yes. And that's probably the first answer that popped into your head. And that response right there is a trap. Because if you've been watching the news, scrolling through social media, or listening to politicians for the last decade, you have been trained to think democracy is the highest moral good, the will of the people, the majority decides. Therefore, we must protect democracy, defend democracy, save democracy. We're told Trump is the end of democracy. We're told progressives are the end of democracy. Every election cycle, every outrage headline, every breathless talking head screams the same thing. Our democracy is under attack. So let me answer the question directly. Do I want to live in a democracy? Hell no. Democracy, in the strictest sense, in the purest sense, isn't just overrated, it's dangerous. And left unchecked, a pure democracy is almost guaranteed to destroy any society that worships it. Our founding fathers knew this too. And before you fly off the handle, slow down, because this is about logic, not politics. A pure democracy has one defining feature, and that is, the majority can vote away anything. There is no moral boundary, there is no legal red line, there is no natural right that survives a popular vote. Whatever you believe is sacred, your speech, your religion, your property, your bodily autonomy, exists only until 51% decides otherwise. Nothing is sacred. Nothing. That's it. End of story. Now, do we live in a pure democracy today? No, not exactly, but the inherent danger still remains. People typically think of a democracy as a form of government where authority is derived from the consent of the governed, normally exercised through free and fair elections. But even our current constitutional democracy can trend toward majority pressure over time because institutions get captured, norms decay, and emergency powers expand. But regardless of how you look at it, all democracies can rape your individual and natural rights with enough votes. Let's go back to our island thought experiment in the previous chapters. Say Christians form the majority. Under pure democracy, they could outlaw other religions, censor science, mandate church attendance, enforce biblical education, regulate speech, criminalize dissent. All legally, all democratically. Democracy doesn't protect minorities. It doesn't protect individuals. It doesn't protect the truth. It protects numbers. So let's call it what it is. Democracy is mob rule with a nice label. It's the idea that 51% of the people should be able to decide what happens to the other 49%, even if that decision destroys their lives. Slavery? Legal, if popular. Oppression, incarceration, torture? All legal, if it is popular enough. What if men outnumbered women and voted to strip away their individual natural rights? What if women outnumbered men and outlawed guns, gambling, or speech they didn't like? And in the real world, where states and counties have certain autonomy, what happens when enough Muslims congregate in one area and implement Sharia law? Are you going to be okay with that? As long as they have the majority, right? It's all legitimate. That should terrify you. Now, let me address the critics out there, the constitutionalists, the lawyers, academia, and other self-described civic experts who nitpick semantics related to democracy. Let's strip this down to mechanics. At a basic level, a system is a democracy if law derives legitimacy from collective choice. Authority is justified by majority consent, and rules can be changed by approved procedures involving voting. Now, introduce whatever threshold you want, 51%, 60%, 67%, 75%, 90%, it doesn't matter. Because the moment legitimacy comes from votes, then respect for your individual and natural rights are conditional on those votes. Even if the threshold is high, or the process is slow, even if there are layered safeguards, courts exist, the Constitution exists. All those things exist only because a past majority allowed them to exist, and it can be altered by a future majority using the same legitimizing logic. So this should be irrefutable. If a system is ultimately grounded in democratic legitimacy, then sufficiently large majority can always outlaw natural rights. This statement is logically true. Not rhetorically true, not emotionally true, structurally true. So with all due respect to my fellow Americans, when you are screaming for democracy, you sound foolish, at least to me. Look, I'm Gen X. I've lived through recessions. I've watched political parties flip-flop on values. I've lived under the religious tyranny in my youth through the progressive tyranny today. I know something younger generations might not have learned yet. What's popular today can easily be despised tomorrow. That's why you should never want to anchor your individual rights to popularity. Natural rights must be protected from the majority, not granted by it. Legal rights are only morally legitimate when they align with natural rights. Government does not create our individual natural rights. It either recognizes them or it violates them. Here's the part society seems to be ignoring. Democracy assumes a reasonably informed population, a fairly rational population, a fairly just population. That assumption is flawed. and now dying as Americans are getting dumber every day. The founders assumed a population capable of reading arguments, tracking cause and effect, recognizing incentives, and judging trade-offs. Consent was not emotional approval. It was informed acceptance, a citizen understanding what power was being granted, to whom, and at what risk. When literacy was deep, logic was trained, and attention was sustained, a government that crossed moral or constitutional boundaries could be understood as illegitimate. Resistance was not a feeling, it was a reasoned conclusion. But when literacy becomes shallow, logic becomes optional, attention fragments, consent stops being about understanding structure. And if deception is involved, we slide back into the realm of coercion again, but this time it's government coercion. Either way, consent becomes driven by emotional alignment. People no longer evaluate systems, they react to stories. They don't track second-order consequences, they respond to moral signaling. Power is no longer judged by constraints and incentives, but by intentions and tone. Authority shifts from reasoned legitimacy to narrative dominance. At that point, consent to the governed still gets invoked, but it's really just feel-good semantic nonsense. Because what's being consented to isn't fully understood. The public isn't authorizing power, it's being managed by it. The founders knew that self-government only works when citizens are capable of self-restraint, delayed gratification, and disciplined reasoning. Remove those capacities, and democracy doesn't disappear, it mutates. You still get elections, you still get slogans, you still get majorities. What you don't get is informed consent. And once consent no longer requires comprehension, liberty becomes optional, because power no longer needs to justify itself in terms people can actually evaluate. And today, the SS comprehension and reason, that ship sailed away a long time ago. And that is the danger. Not the disagreement, not the diversity, but a civilization that still uses Enlightenment language while quietly abandoning the logical foundation that made it real. We are not seeing democracy break down. That is democracy. That's democracy doing exactly what it does when it's untethered from natural rights. Once moral boundaries are subject to a vote, ignorance doesn't just become a liability, it becomes law. Illogical people don't just hold opinions, they implement them. And irrational majorities just don't believe in false things, they enforce them. Democracy doesn't collapse into tyranny despite ignorance, it collapses into tyranny through it. So how real is this danger? Well, in the US and some other Western cultures, we are experiencing something that's called the reverse Flynn effect, a measurable decline in intelligence and critical thinking. The US is ranked 37th in math, 18th in science. IQ trends are declining, logical reasoning is deteriorating, critical thinking is collapsing. Our ability to think critically, to problem solve, going down the toilet, with some studies showing a global decline in the order of magnitude of 20%. 20%! Holy shit! This is unprecedented. Across recorded history, societies have become more cognitively demanding, and measured cognitive performance rose sharply during the modern era, until recently. And democracy doesn't get safer as intelligence drops, it becomes more dangerous. Why? Because for our democracy, competence matters, not causation. If education quality declines, attention spans collapse, numeracy deteriorates, critical thinking weakens, emotional reasoning replaces logic, then the majority vote systems become less stable and more dangerous, regardless of the cause. And it doesn't matter why Americans are getting dumber for this particular argument. I will explain why in later podcasts. It just matters that it is happening, that IQ is dropping, that critical thinking skills are going down the toilet. Whether that decline comes from schooling, environment, nutrition, culture, media incentives, immigration patterns, is at best secondary to the political consequence, at worst completely irrelevant. I'm not arguing about essence, I am arguing about functional capacity. This is a risk argument, not a biological one. A pilot doesn't care about why the plane is losing altitude, only that it is. Marxism, socialism, communism, progressive enslavement of citizens. These perspectives are born from ignorance and a lack of critical thinking. And because our system allows these people to vote, our individual rights and liberty are very fragile when our system allows dumb, freeloading, self-serving people to vote. And I believe this dumbing down of the average American is going to accelerate in the near future. And it's going to be driven by artificial intelligence. AI use is already rising, especially among young people. They use it for schoolwork, reports, documents, summaries, presentations, brainstorming, decision-making, and information gathering. And they're using it as a substitute for reasoning and critical thinking. This means they're not developing those skills. And worse, they're not even questioning the accuracy of what AI is telling them. AI tool can confidently generate obvious distortions of reality. That should be a warning sign to us. And as AI improves, it will become harder to tell what's real and what's fake. Not just with images and videos, but also reporting, facts, data, statistics. In our founders' generation, functional literacy meant sustained attention, following multi-step arguments, understanding abstractions, comparing competing claims, writing structured arguments and rebuttals by hand, public debate without prompts or slides, reading long, dense text, sustained attention over hours, familiarity with logic, history, moral philosophy, and law. A 20-year-old like James Madison was reading Locke, Montesquieu, Roman history, legal dissertations. That was not rare among educated young men in those times. It was expected. It is, however, very rare among American teenagers today. At best, the average young adult today can extract facts, navigate multimedia, and summarize narratives. Far fewer can actually track premises across paragraphs, detect logical contradictions, evaluate second-order consequences, separate rhetoric from argument. They struggle with long-form reading, logical sequencing, abstract argument, holding multiple premises in mind, distinguishing rhetoric from reasoning. This isn't stupidity, it's environmental conditioning. During the time of the American Revolution, logic was explicitly taught. Education emphasized cause and effect, syllogistic reasoning, contradiction detection, moral logic and reasoning, incentive analysis, and classical rhetoric. Today, logic is rarely taught explicitly. It's often replaced by feelings-first reasoning, narrative framing, and social consensus cues. Many teens today are encouraged to assert beliefs, identify with positions, and signal moral alignment, but not to actually test premises, steelman opponents, or trace second-order effects. As a result, beliefs are held strongly, but defended weakly, and revised emotionally, not logically. And when it comes to attention span and cognitive endurance, holy hell, our founders' generation dominated. This one arguably matters more than IQ. Our founding fathers' generation had no dopamine-rich distractions. Reading was entertainment. Attention endurance was trained daily. Jefferson could read for hours by candlelight and then write letters that would pass peer review scrutiny. Today, their cell phones deliver variable reward loops. Attention is fragmented. Cognitive stamina is completely underdeveloped. You ask a modern teen to read Federalist number 10, they're mentally exhausted before they even start. So the American founders, many of them barely older than college students, were raised in a culture that trained logic, demanded deep literacy, and rewarded disciplined reasoning. Today, teenagers are surrounded far more by information than by any generation in history, yet are far less trained in sustained logic and argument. Not because they're less capable, but because the culture no longer trains those muscles. That's a training gap, not a genetic one. And again, why this matters is because our founders assumed voters could read arguments, citizens could follow logic, disagreement could be reasoned through, consent required comprehension. However, our modern democracy works through emotional legitimacy, narrative persuasion, authority by credential, and compliance without understanding. Those are very different assumptions about human cognition. We need to start thinking critically again. We need to refocus our passion away from democracy. Democracy is not the purpose of government. It is the means. Democracy is not a goal either. Our goal is simple: liberty. Government should exist for one reason, and that is to secure our natural rights. Life, liberty, property, our pursuit of happiness, our individual right to be left alone. When the government fails at that, it becomes oppressive and tyrannical. Thomas Jefferson said it plainly in the Declaration of Independence. Governments are instituted to secure these rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when they become destructive to those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish them. Your freedom to pursue your own version of happiness should not require permission, and it should not be treated as a crime so long as you aren't violating the rights of others. Restricting people from pursuing their own unique happiness is a moral crime, and that argument should appeal even to utilitarians and consequentialists. In the famous words of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. And if we agree on that, then we should all agree that democracy as a goal is crap. And speaking of crap, let me poke the bear even more. What if I told you the U.S. Constitution is a deeply flawed, overhyped document that doesn't deserve the pedestal we place it on? Well, statistically, that reaction you're feeling right now is probably anger, offense, defensiveness. And that's not accidental. It's conditioned. Over 80% of Americans say the Constitution is an important symbol of this nation. So if you feel triggered by my statement, if that bothers you, it probably means you don't fully understand where this country came from. And frankly, that's understandable. Most Americans were taught a sanitized, feel-good version of our American history, one that skips the uncomfortable parts. I consider myself to be a deeply patriotic American, probably more patriotic than most people who use that word, because my patriotism isn't rooted in symbols, it's rooted in principles, liberty, natural rights, the Enlightenment idea that government exists to protect the individual, not manage them. The American Revolution is one of the most extraordinary events in human history. It wasn't just another war over land or resources or dynastic squabbles. It was the first intellectual revolution for individual liberty. For the first time, ordinary people rejected monarchy aristocracy, and inherited authority, and replaced it with a radical idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. That's not normal in human history. And it's worth remembering something else. The revolution was not fought to establish the U.S. Constitution. It was fought to secure liberty and natural rights. And if any of this sounds theoretical, let's ground this in reality. On April 19th, 1775, regular people stood on Lexington Green, armed, organized, and fully aware of what they were risking. They weren't soldiers. They weren't revolutionaries by profession. They were civilians, farmers, tradesmen, fathers. And they weren't there to overthrow a government. They were there to defend their natural rights. British troops, also considered to be basically the law enforcement of the day, had been sent to disarm them. Let that sink in. The government showed up to confiscate weapons. The people said no. And the shot heard around the world wasn't fired by a standing army. It wasn't fired by a general. It was fired by a civilian. Well, that's the consensus anyway. Nobody really knows who fired the first shot. Either way, that single moment detonated something new in human history. By the end of the day, thousands of ordinary citizens had joined the fight, pushing the British forces back to Boston. That wasn't chaos. That wasn't mob rule. That was a population enforcing a moral boundary. And that's the part modern Americans are rarely taught. The revolution wasn't just a rebellion. It was a blueprint. A blueprint built on the radical idea that the government derives its power from the consent of the governed, not the other way around. It emphasized individual liberty, self-reliance, a constrained government whose job was to protect rights, not trample them. That's what made America special. Long before the U.S. Constitution, the principles came first, the blood came first, the rights came first. Why? Because what happened on Lexington Green is proof that natural rights exist before law. And let's get something straight. There is a difference between natural rights and legal rights. Natural rights exist whether government recognizes them or not. Legal rights are just ink on paper. They only matter if they align with those natural rights. Government doesn't create our individual rights. It either respects them or violates them. That's the basis for being able to execute this entire moral framework in this series. When the British troops showed up at Lexington Green to disarm civilians, the colonists didn't say, well, technically Parliament passed a law. They understood something deeper. They understood that that law had crossed a moral boundary. That's what made the resistance morally justified, and that's what made the American Revolution morally legitimate. So when we talk about the greatness of America or the founders, it's important to look at it accurately. Their greatness wasn't perfection. It was direction. The Enlightenment philosophy was not built on naive optimism about human goodness. It was built on disciplined observation of human nature. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Dave Hume did not begin with theories about how people ought to behave. They began with evidence of how people do behave. They studied history, conflict, cooperation, incentives, and failure. They watched how power corrupts, how fear drives cruelty, how self-interest motivates effort, how trust collapses when rules are unclear. Without modern data or brain scans, they still recognize the core truth. Human beings are neither angels nor beasts, but predictable mixtures of impulse, reason, self-interest, and social instinct. What makes this pretty remarkable is that they reached these conclusions without evolutionary biology, neuroscience, or modern psychology. They had no vocabulary for dopamine, tribal wiring, dominance hierarchies, or cognitive bias, and yet they correctly inferred the operating system beneath human behavior. They understood that incentives matter more than intentions, that unchecked power invites abuse, and that moral systems fail when they only rely on virtue rather than structure. In modern terms, they reverse engineered human psychology using philosophy, history, and lived experience, arriving at insights that evolutionary science would later confirm rather than contradict. Just as importantly, they understood that human beings are not merely motivated by survival or obedience, but by the pursuit of meaning and happiness as they themselves define it. The Enlightenment did not promise happiness. It defended the freedom to pursue it. That distinction matters. A moral system that denies individuals the right to seek their own fulfillment breeds resentment, stagnation, and rebellion. This is why Enlightenment thought emphasized liberty over enforced virtue, choice over compulsion, and consent over command. The American founders absorbed this lesson fully. Government exists not to decide what happiness looks like, but to protect the space in which individuals may pursue it, so long as they do not violate the natural rights of others. That was not softness, it was realism. A system designed around human nature, human ambition, human dignity, without pretending humans could ever be perfect. They made the largest leap toward liberty the world had ever seen, not by getting everything right, but by grounding government in a radical idea that its purpose is to protect pre-existing natural rights, not to find new ones. Up until then, most wars were about resources, borders, or bloodlines. This one was about liberty. And it worked so well that much of the world later copied pieces of the American system while still mocking the culture that produced it. You know, though anecdotal, I've done enough international traveling and have had exposure enough to notice that Canadian, British, and many other Western cultures often see Americans as loud, brash, emotionally unrestrained, socially unsophisticated, and excessively patriotic, with a troubling comfort around firearms. And I'm sure I did nothing to relieve them of that stereotype in our discussions. They view displays of national pride not as confidence or independence, but as immaturity, insecurity, and a failure to evolve beyond a frontier mentality. Those pompous elitists. But I say fine, let them feel that way. When you look at European history, it makes sense. They are descendants of a broken people. For centuries, their people lived under kings, queens, aristocrats, and rigid hierarchies. They were trained to submit, not to govern themselves. In many Western nations, that legacy evolved its people into beggars relying on governments or their king to take care of them. They became subjects or servants dependent on bureaucracy. They conformed to the notion that the state is expected to manage its people's risks, security, and outcomes. And they had been conditioned to accept their station in life for centuries. Americans didn't have that luxury. The American colonists had to survive a dangerous frontier. Survival here meant brutal winters, scorching summers, food shortages, disease, isolation, Indian raids, and native dangers. Settlers built their own homes, hunted their own food, defended their own lives, often weeks or months away from formal government or law enforcement. There was no standing army to protect them. They were the first line of defense. Self-sufficiency wasn't a virtue signal. Gun ownership wasn't cultural theater. Both were absolute necessities. And unlike the rigid European class systems, America became a place where anybody could build something if they were willing to work for it. So when Europeans criticize American culture, I say let them. They've been doing it for 250 years, and they're not going to stop until they realize that they've traded liberty for comfort and become managed subjects of their state. They are the frog in the lukewarm water that's being set to boil. I mean, look what's happening in Canada, England, and other European countries. It's becoming a self-destructive and foolish woke shit show. The unwarranted intellectual arrogance, it's amazing. Some things will never change, I guess. When British soldiers arrived to crush the rebellion, they expected an easy victory over untrained militia. Instead, they encountered unfamiliar terrain, hostile conditions, and people who didn't fight by European rules. Forests, swamps, mountains, brutal winters. The British troops found the American environment to be diabolical. Some of them literally, like satanic. They were scared of the snakes, the serpents, particularly rattlesnakes, cutting paths through the jungle at night, encountering wolves and bears. They complained of alligators in the swamps. They were shocked at the force and power of our storms. In short, they were pissing their pants. And then to make matters worse, the colonists knew how to use firearms, not as symbols, but as tools. Tools for hunting, survival, defense, and when necessary, resistance against authority that violated natural rights. Natural rights weren't abstract philosophy to the colonists. They were lived necessities. Liberty wasn't a slogan, it was a survival strategy. These people who demanded property rights, self-defense, due process, and local control weren't idealists. They were people shaped by the risk, distance, and distrust of centralized power. And that brings us back to first principles. This country was rooted in Enlightenment philosophy and fueled by common sense. Literally. A small pamphlet written by Thomas Paine called Common Sense argued that government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. That society is natural, and that government is a necessary evil justified only in its ability to protect life, liberty, and property. Thomas Paine's Common Sense sold 500,000 copies in a population of 2.5 million. Again, the revolution was not fought for the Constitution. It was fought by citizens against a government, against law enforcement, against a king for liberty. And Lexington is where that reality became irreversible. Anyway, after the Battle of Independence was won, the second battle began. The battle over what kind of government would replace the king. And this is where the mythology really breaks down. The Constitution was far from universally admired. It was somewhere between highly questionable and crap for many of the revolutionary intellects and patriots who actually fought in the revolution. The fight over the ratification of the U.S. Constitution was brutal. On one side, you had Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. On the other, you had Thomas Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists, such as Patrick Henry, George Mason, Thomas Paine, and a long list of men who actually understood human nature and power. Hamilton wanted centralized authority. Jefferson didn't. Hamilton believed liberty needed to be managed. Jefferson believed liberty needed to be protected. The Federalists wanted a strong national government, strong courts, strong executive power, standing armies, centralized finance, consolidated authority. They didn't hide that goal. What they did hide is how radical it was compared to what the revolution was actually fought for. They branded themselves Federalists, but let's be honest, they were centralists, supporters of big government with a talent for rebranding. Calling themselves Federalists in the 18th century was equivalent to calling a modern bill the Inflation Reduction Act, knowing full well it would do the opposite. The Federalists wanted flexibility. a system that could adapt to future crises. That might sound reasonable until you realize flexibility in government almost always means unlimited interpretation. The Anti-Federalists saw right through it. They warned that once power was consolidated at the center, it would never shrink, only expand, that elites would dominate government, that ordinary citizens would lose meaningful control, that states would be hollowed out and devoured by a distant authority too far removed from the people it governed. They weren't guessing. They were extrapolating from history. They didn't oppose government, they opposed unchecked power. Patrick Henry warned that the presidency could slide into monarchy, not because the office was evil, but because ambition plus power always drifts toward dominance if left unchecked. George Mason called the proposed Constitution highly objectionable, arguing that it lacked sufficient protections for individual liberty. Others warned openly that the document was designed by men of wealth for men of wealth, an oligarch structure dressed up as republicanism. They accused the Federalists of attempting to replace one form of aristocracy with another. Not kings and nobles this time, but bankers, lawyers, and political elites. And here's the part that most Americans are rarely taught. The Constitution only passed because the Anti-Federalists forced a compromise. That compromise was the Bill of Rights. Without it, there was no ratification. Period. The Anti-Federalists refused to sign on to a system that didn't explicitly protect speech, religion, arms, due process, property, and privacy. They understood that the vague promises and structural constraints were not enough. They wanted hard limits, written in plain language that the future governments could not reinterpret away without exposing themselves. And Hamilton fought them every step of the way. In Federalist number 84, he argued that a Bill of Rights was unnecessary. He claimed that because the federal government only possessed powers explicitly granted to it, it had no authority to violate individual liberties in the first place. Therefore, spelling out rights was redundant. His argument boiled down to this: why declare things that shall not be done if there's no power to do so? That sounded clever. It wasn't. It was catastrophically naive. And thank God the Anti-Federalists did not buy this. The Bill of Rights wasn't symbolism, and it wasn't virtue signaling. It was a leash. And they weren't wrong. We are all living with the consequences today. Without those amendments, the Constitution would have been a blank check for centralized authority. And even with them, look where we are. Mass surveillance, censorship, asset forfeiture, regulatory strangulation, inflation theft, permanent bureaucracies, a two-party cartel pretending to be democracy. This is exactly what the Anti-Federalists warned about, and why they fought like hell to lock liberty into writing. Those Bill of Rights amendments are guardrails. Every time the government tries to chip away at your rights, those amendments stand in the way of total control. And let's be honest about something else. When people talk about their constitutional rights, they're almost always referring to the Bill of Rights, not the original Constitution. And even with them, overreach is everywhere. Imagine what it would look like without them. If the patriots who fought for independence could see the mess we're in today, they'd be furious. A lot of today's politicians would have been tarred and feathered, guaranteed. Now, if you still think I'm being too harsh calling the Constitution garbage, let's just quickly review some of the realities. It wasn't some perfect product of Enlightenment genius. Much of it was borrowed structural concepts from Britain. Swapping the king for a president, Parliament for Congress. Instead of the House of Lords, we had the Senate. Instead of the House of Commons, we had the House of Representatives. Hamilton also pushed for centralized banking. He supported a standing federal military, not just for defense, but to enforce compliance with federal laws. And where the Constitution did have latitude, it still contained massive moral failures. It legalized slavery through compromises like the 3/5 Clause. It ignored women entirely. Half the population was disenfranchised. It stripped Native Americans of natural rights and left them without any meaningful protection. It also laid the groundwork for political dysfunction and a structure that helped entrench a two-party system, locking citizens into two flawed options while power oscillates between the interests rather than principles. And it gets worse. It left economic liberty and free markets exposed. Clauses like the Necessary and Proper Clause or the General Welfare Clause became justifications for endless federal expansion. The government prints money, expands debt, invades personal freedom, consolidates power, and sells it all as democracy. You can admit that this document was a piece of crap. That doesn't make you anti-American. It makes you honest. Now, to be fair, Alexander Hamilton wasn't a total moron. He wasn't lazy, and he wasn't useless. As George Washington's aide-de-camp during the American Revolution, Hamilton drafted orders, wrote correspondence, handled logistics, and kept things moving. He was a patriot, and in my opinion, deserves the respect that goes along with that. But let's not confuse execution with vision, nor passion with wisdom. Hamilton wasn't a philosopher. He wasn't a deep economist, and he wasn't an Enlightenment thinker on the level of Jefferson or Paine. He didn't wrestle with human nature. He tried to manage it. And if you've been following this series, you already understand that is a distinction that requires coercion. I don't get it. He had access to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the father of economics, and the core arguments for limited government and decentralization. Yet he moved in the complete opposite direction. Hamilton's instinct over and over again was control, centralization, consolidation, standing authority, permanent structures, a belief that order had to be imposed from the top down, because left to themselves, people couldn't be trusted. This worldview didn't come from liberty. It came from fear of disorder, and you could see it clearly in how he used rebellions, not to learn from them, but to justify power grabs. In 1786, 5 years after the Battle of Yorktown that ended the war, Shays' Rebellion broke out in Massachusetts. Farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, were being crushed by taxes and debt. The very people who fought the British were now losing their farms to courts and creditors. So they resisted. They pushed back. Hamilton seized on this immediately. To him, Shays' Rebellion wasn't a warning about bad policy or economic abuse. It was proof that ordinary citizens were dangerous. He used it as propaganda. This, he argued, is why we need a stronger central government, a standing army, more authority, more control. But notice what he didn't argue. He didn't say that maybe taxes were unjust, maybe veterans shouldn't be bankrupt by the elites, or that maybe the government overreach caused the unrest to begin with. No, his solution was more government. Shays' Rebellion became Hamilton's talking point for ratification. Fear was the lever, disorder was the excuse. And once the Constitution passed, once Hamilton got real power, we saw exactly what that mindset produced. Fast forward a few years, Hamilton is now Treasury Secretary. And what does he do? He imposes a tax on whiskey, a product that the frontier farmers literally used as currency, a tax that hit small producers the hardest, a tax that benefited Eastern elites and financiers. Predictably, farmers resisted. This became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. And here's the part that should permanently end the myth of Hamilton as a liberty-minded architect. Hamilton didn't de-escalate. He didn't negotiate. He didn't rethink the policy. He called in the army, a massive show of federal force, troops marching against citizens to crush resistance to attacks. The same man who used Shays' Rebellion to argue for standing army then used the army against the people. This wasn't about liberty. It was about control. Hamilton didn't fear tyranny. He feared disorder. And when those two clashed, history shows which one he was willing to sacrifice. This is the pattern Anti-Federalists warned us about. Centralized power doesn't solve unrest. It creates it. Then it uses that unrest to justify more power. Hamilton saw rebellion not as feedback, but as a failure to comply. His instinct wasn't restraint. It was enforcement. That's not Enlightenment thinking. That's authoritarianism. Contrast that with Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists. They understood that rebellion isn't always a threat to liberty. Sometimes it's a signal that liberty has already been violated. Jefferson famously argued that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, a reminder that government exists on probation. Hamilton believed the government should exist above the people. That's the divide, and that divide never closed. We didn't just inherit Hamilton's financial system, we inherited his mindset. Crisis drove centralization, resistance drove enforcement, disorder drove justification, and that logic is still running today. Look, Hamilton wasn't evil. He probably thought he was doing the right thing. But history doesn't grade intentions, it grades outcomes. And the outcome of Hamilton's vision is a federal government that expands endlessly, uses crisis as fuel, treats dissent as threat, and manages citizens instead of serving them. Again, the Anti-Federalists warned us. They lost the long game, not because they were wrong, but because Hamilton's model is seductive, but at the cost of liberty. And once you trade liberty for order, you don't get that liberty back without a fight. Hamilton's mistake was not technical, it was moral. He treated rights as things government could safely assume responsibility for. The Anti-Federalists understood the danger in that, because once legal rights drift away from natural rights, the law doesn't become neutral, it becomes hostile. That's why the Bill of Rights mattered. Not because it granted freedoms, but because it acknowledged limits. It wasn't saying, here's what the government allows. It was saying, here's what the government is forbidden to touch. That is a very different philosophy. Now let's talk about burning the flag. Burn a flag and suddenly everybody's a constitutional scholar. Yes, it's legal. And yes, it should be legal. But burn an American flag, people lose their minds. Even Donald Trump leaned into that instinct. After liberal protesters burned American flags, he said they should face jail time, maybe even lose citizenship. And when people pointed out that that's unconstitutional, he waved it off as stupid. He was wrong. The flag is a symbol, a powerful one, but the flag is fabric. Liberty is sacred. Our founders burned symbols of authority. They defied authority. They mocked power. They defended offensive speech. They committed acts that would be labeled as extremism today. What they cared about wasn't the cloth, it was liberty. Patriotism is defending freedom, even when it offends you. So no, Trump is wrong on this point. Burning your own American flag is morally defensible. Patriotism isn't about symbols. Real patriotism isn't about obedience. It's vigilance. It's defending liberty even when it offends you. And this is probably my number one issue with Trump. It's not his desire to make America great again. That's admirable. It's his lack of understanding of what has always made us great. Liberty, self-reliance, free markets. Don't get me wrong. He brings a lot to the table in today's environment. But on flag burning, he's flat out wrong. Your flag, your property, your right to burn it. If that irritates conservatives, Trump supporters, or self-proclaimed patriots, I like to submit it's because they don't understand the origins of this country or the intellectual battle that led to its formation. Because the moment speech is protected only when it's polite, it's not protected at all. Real patriotism isn't about defending fabric. It's about defending freedom. Freedom of speech and expression are critical to a free society. You don't have to like what someone says, but the moment you let the government censor speech based on offensiveness, you're on a slippery slope to tyranny. And that brings us to where we are today. Our way of life is under attack, not just from China, Russia, and the radical Islamic regimes, but also from socialist-leaning Western governments that don't even realize they're sinking into a state-sponsored slavery. In France, the UK, Germany, Italy, you can be fined or jailed for saying something the government considers offensive, even if it's true. The EU, Digital Services Act, forces big tech to remove content the government deems hate speech, misinformation, or just offensive. And it gets worse. Canada made it a crime to misgender someone repeatedly, calling it harassment. Scotland just passed a hate crime bill a few years ago that literally criminalizes offensive speech in private conversations. In your own home. Think about that. In much of the West today, just doing this podcast could land me in prison. And this is why the right to burn a flag matters. Our American flag is just a piece of colored fabric created by the government. The real American values aren't found in symbols. They're found in liberty, natural rights, and the freedom to think, speak, and act without government interference. If you're more offended by someone burning the flag than by the erosion of liberty itself, then you've missed the entire point of the revolution and you should never call yourself a patriot. I would like to believe that our military, the men and women who serve this country, signed up to defend liberty, not to protect a flag that could be repurposed tomorrow into a symbol of a Marxist regime. I would like to believe we're better than the Islamic extremists who want to kill people for mocking their religious figures. I would like to believe Americans still understand what makes us different, what makes us exceptional. So yeah, real patriots defend liberty, even when it offends them. Our founders fought for it, our military fights for it, and if a civil war ever breaks out over it, I will stand with those who fight for it. And should we ever find ourselves watching some jackass burning the flag, I say we crack open a beer, take a deep breath, and salute the men and women who sacrificed everything so that idiot could have the right to be an idiot. Because that's what real liberty is. End of story. So in closing, democracy isn't sacred. The Constitution isn't sacred. The flag isn't sacred. Liberty is. And liberty is not self-sustaining. It's not automatic. Liberty survives only when people understand what it is and are willing to defend it. Because there are two ways a society can get conquered. One is obvious. Military, tanks, bombs, foreign flags. The other is slower and deadlier, and that's the conquest of the mind. A population taught to worship government solutions. A culture trained to treat offense as harm. A generation raised to confuse comfort with freedom. And a political class that sells control as compassion. That's how you lose a nation without ever firing a shot. So if you're proud to be an American, don't be proud of the fabric. Be proud of the principles and be ruthless about protecting the conditions that make those principles possible. And on that controversial note, peace out from Virginia.